The dawn of the 8th of June, 1944, did not break over the Normandy coastline so much as it seeped through a low, oppressive ceiling of cloud and smoke. 2 days after the cataclysm of D-Day, the air remained thick with a permanent, gritty haze, a foul concoction of salt spray, powdered masonry, burning oil, and the faint, sickly sweet odour of death that drifted from fields yet uncleared. The land itself was a scarred and brutalised thing, the neat hedgerows of the Norman bocage, ancient earthen banks crowned with dense, tangled roots, were now torn apart by tank treads and shellfire, their exposed soil dark and wet like old blood. Craters pockmarked the fields, filled with murky, rainwater that reflected the grey sky like 1,000 sightless eyes. This was the landscape of the great, grinding Allied push inland, a slow, painful advance against an enemy who defended every lane, every farmhouse, every inch of soil with a fanatical and desperate skill. Along a narrow, sunken lane, barely wider than a single truck, a river of olive drab and dust was flowing. This was not the famed, dramatic spearhead of the armoured divisions, but the vital, unglamorous lifeblood of the entire invasion, a supply convoy of the US First Army. It was a crawling, serpentine beast of machinery, a testament to American industrial might and logistical desperation. At its head rolled a jeep, its windshield folded down, a .30 caliber machine gun mounted on its rear, its driver and commander scanning the overhanging hedgerows with tired, nervous eyes. Behind it followed the true giants of the column, immense, 10-wheeled GMC CCKW trucks, their canvas covers stretched taut over mountains of crated ammunition, wooden boxes of K-rations, jerrycans of water and gasoline, and medical supplies. The weight of these vehicles was so immense that their heavy tires chewed deep into the damp, chalky soil of the lane, leaving parallel trenches that would harden in the Sunday. The air vibrated with the deep, guttural roar of 100 engines, a sound that was both a declaration of power and a beacon to every German artillery spotter for miles. Inside the lead truck, a man known simply as Sergeant Mack was the undisputed master of his own noisy, rattling domain. His hands, thick-fingered and permanently stained with grease, rested on the massive steering wheel with a practiced ease born of countless miles on the Red Ball Express. His face was leathery and creased, his eyes hidden behind a pair of issue sunglasses that reflected the monotonous green wall of the hedgerow sliding past his window. He was a man of few words and immense patience, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, and he understood that his unglamorous, tedious job was, in many ways, more important than that of the infantryman. The men at the front needed his bullets, his beans, and his bandages. Without him and the countless convoys like this one, the entire advance would shudder to a halt. The war would be lost not in a fiery charge, but in a silent, hungry stalemate. The convoy was a moving universe of sound and smell. The roar of the engines was a constant, oppressive blanket of noise, but beneath it was a symphony of smaller, more intimate sounds. The constant, rattling vibration of every bolt and panel in the truck cabs, the crunch and squelch of tires on the broken road, the hiss of air brakes from the vehicle behind, and the smell, a unique military aroma of diesel fumes, hot engine oil, dusty canvas, and the faint, sweet scent of chewing tobacco and sweat from the drivers. Each man was isolated in his own metal cockpit, yet bound together in a shared, precarious journey. They were sitting ducks, and they all knew it. A single well-placed mortar round, a burst of machine gun fire from a hidden position in the hedgerow, could turn the narrow lane into a slaughterhouse, a tangled, burning tomb of men and material. The tension was a physical presence, a wire stretched taut from the first vehicle to the last. Eyes constantly scanned the skies for the dreaded shape of a German Focke-Wulf fighter, and the hedgerows for the glint of a sniper's scope or the ominous hollow of a Panzerfaust position. The recent memory of the brutal fighting on the beaches was fresh in every mind. They had all seen the wreckage on the shore, the sunken landing craft, the burned-out tanks, the rows of blanket-covered bodies. That same violence could erupt here, in this deceptively quiet French countryside, at any second. The pastoral beauty of the landscape was a lie, a thin veneer over a world of sudden, violent death. The chirping of birds in the hedges was an insult, a bizarre and jarring reminder of a peace that no longer existed. The lane began to narrow even further, the hedgerows pressing in from both sides like living, green walls. Their branches, thick with summer growth, scraped against the sides of the trucks with a sound like 1,000 fingernails on a chalkboard. The sky was reduced to a thin grey strip overhead. The convoy was now deep in the bocage, a labyrinth that had already proven to be a death trap for Allied armour and infantry. Every bend in the road was a blind corner, a potential ambush point. The drivers' knuckles were white on their steering wheels, their feet hovering over the brakes. The machine gunners in the jeeps swiveled their weapons back and forth, their fingers resting lightly on the triggers. The air, thick with engine heat and human anxiety, became almost unbearable. It was at this moment, as the convoy navigated a particularly sharp bend, that the impossible happened. The lead jeep rounded the corner, and the driver slammed on his brakes so hard the vehicle skidded slightly in the loose dirt. The commander raised a clenched fist, the signal to halt. The order was passed back down the line, a wave of flashing brake lights and hissing air that travelled the length of the Serpent, bringing the entire multi-ton beast to a groaning, shuddering standstill. For a moment there was a profound and unsettling silence, broken only by the ticking of hot engines and the frantic pounding of 100 hearts. Every man expected the crack of a sniper's rifle, the crump of a mortar launch, but no attack came. Instead, there was only a placid, almost serene obstruction. Standing in the absolute centre of the lane, precisely where the two ruts were deepest, was a donkey. It was a small, grey, and seemingly ancient creature, its back bowed with years of labour, its coat matted and dusty. Its head was down, and it was nibbling with single-minded concentration on a particularly tough, thorny branch of bramble that grew from the base of the hedgerow. It did not look up. It did not acknowledge the sudden arrival of this immense, roaring, metallic predator. It was a creature of timeless, rural rhythm, utterly unconcerned with the urgencies of war. The initial reaction in the lead jeep was one of stunned disbelief, which quickly curdled into exasperation. The commander gestured furiously for his driver to sound the horn. A sharp, electric blare shattered the silence, a sound utterly alien in this ancient landscape. The donkey's long ears twitched slightly, a flicker of annoyance, but it did not move. It continued its methodical chewing, its hips firmly planted in the middle of the road. It was an immovable object in the path of an irresistible force. Sergeant Mack, from his elevated perch in the truck, watched the scene unfold with a weary sense of inevitability. This was the war, in microcosm, not the grand strategy of generals, but the absurd, mundane reality of a million small things going wrong. A single, stubborn donkey was now holding up the might of the United States Army. He could see the jeep's commander getting out, his sidearm still holstered, his hands waving in frustration. Two soldiers from the back of the jeep approached the animal cautiously, trying to shoo it away. They clapped their hands, they shouted, their voices thin and strained against the vast silence of the bocage. The donkey lifted its head for a moment, fixing them with one large, liquid, and profoundly indifferent eye, before lowering it again to continue its meal. It was clear that verbal persuasion was useless. The soldiers then attempted physical coercion. One of them moved to the donkey's rear and gave it a firm, but not cruel, push on the hindquarters. The animal's muscles tensed, but it did not budge. It was like pushing against a small, furry mountain. The soldier pushed harder, planting his boots in the dirt and straining. The donkey simply leaned into the pressure, its feet set firmly in the ruts. The other soldier tried to grab its halter and pull its head up. The donkey resisted, its neck becoming a column of pure, stubborn strength. It was a standoff, a battle of wills between modern military urgency and prehistoric agricultural obstinacy. The donkey was winning. Minutes ticked by. Precious, irreplaceable minutes. In the context of a war where battlefield situations could change in moments, this delay was catastrophic. The convoy was stacked up in a vulnerable line for over a mile. Radio calls were beginning to crackle from the rear, demanding a status report. The commander's frustration was turning to anger and a tinge of panic. He looked at the donkey, then at the impenetrable hedgerows on either side. There was no way around. The lanes were too narrow, the banks too steep and soft to risk a vehicle getting stuck. To reverse the entire convoy back down the treacherous lane was an unthinkable logistical nightmare, a process that could take hours and leave them even more exposed. A more drastic solution was proposed. One of the soldiers unslung his M1 Garand from his shoulder. The meaning was clear. It was a brutal, simple, and effective solution. A single shot, and the obstacle would be removed. The war would be able to continue its march. The soldier looked to his commander for confirmation. The commander hesitated, his hand hovering near his own sidearm. It was just a donkey. An animal. There were men dying just a few miles away who needed the supplies in these trucks. The pragmatic choice was obvious, but in that moment of hesitation, something shifted. The sheer absurdity of the situation seemed to crystallize. They were soldiers of the most advanced army in the world, armed with weapons that could shred steel and level buildings, and they were being held hostage by a creature that symbolized backwardness and simplicity. To shoot it felt not just cruel, but profoundly disrespectful, not to the animal, but to the very idea of what they were fighting for. They were here to liberate, to restore order and sanity. This felt like an act of petty tyranny. It was a line, a strangely significant one, that none of them were quite prepared to cross. Sergeant Mack watched this internal debate play out from his truck. He saw the raised rifle, the commander's hesitation. He found himself holding his breath. He had seen so much death, so much casual destruction. The death of this one insignificant animal should have meant nothing. But in that quiet lane, surrounded by the immense pressure of the war, its life suddenly meant a great deal. It was a symbol of the normal, the peaceful, the enduring world that existed outside of their conflict. To destroy it would be an admission that the war had erased all else, that nothing of the old world was sacred. The commander finally shook his head, a sharp, decisive motion. The soldier lowered his rifle with a look of relief. The immediate threat to the donkey was over, but the problem remained. The convoy was still stuck. The donkey, blissfully unaware of its brush with mortality, continued to chew. It had become the most powerful creature in Normandy. It had stopped an army not with force, but with sheer, unassailable presence. The iron river of the Allied war machine had met its match in a few 100 pounds of fur and stubbornness, and as the minutes continued to stretch into a quarter of an hour, then 20 minutes, the true, terrifying consequence of this stalemate began to dawn on every man in the column. They were not just delayed, they were trapped, and in the deceptive quiet of the French countryside, unseen eyes were watching, and a threat far more dangerous than a donkey was now calculating the perfect moment to strike. The standoff in the sunken lane stretched from minutes into a quarter of an hour, a period of time that felt, to the trapped soldiers, like a small eternity. The initial absurdity of the situation curdled into a thick, cloying anxiety. The donkey, the unwitting and indifferent architect of this crisis, remained the picture of rustic tranquility. It had finished the bramble branch and was now nuzzling at a patch of coarse grass growing at the base of the hedgerow, its jaws moving in a slow, circular grind. Each casual flick of its tail, each lazy shift of its weight, was a mockery of the military urgency pulsing through the paralyzed convoy. The beast was a creature of pure, present-tense existence, wholly consumed by the needs of its stomach, utterly deaf to the silent screams of 100 men whose minds were racing miles ahead, to the frontline units waiting for the ammunition and fuel that were now held hostage by this single, four-legged sentry. Inside the lead truck, Sergeant Mack's patience, once as vast and deep as the American heartland from which he came, was eroding like a riverbank in a storm. He watched the scene at the head of the column through his dusty windshield, his knuckles resting on the steering wheel. The initial, almost comical frustration had been replaced by a cold, creeping dread. He was a veteran of too many campaigns not to recognize the smell of danger. This lane was a perfect killing zone. The high, dense hedgerows provided perfect concealment. The narrow, constricted road denied any room for maneuver. The stalled, tightly packed column was a target so ideal it seemed to have been drawn from a tactical manual on ambush doctrine. His eyes, narrowed behind his sunglasses, ceaselessly scanned the green walls on either side, searching for any anomaly, a disturbed branch, a patch of earth that was a different color, the faintest glint of light on metal. He saw nothing, only the dense, impenetrable foliage, buzzing with insects and birds that were oblivious to the human drama unfolding beneath them. Further back in the column, the mood was shifting from confusion to palpable fear. Drivers had cut their engines, unable to bear the waste of precious fuel and the heat building up in the radiators. The sudden relative silence was somehow more terrifying than the constant roar of the motors. It was a silence that amplified every small sound, the creak of a truck's suspension as a driver shifted in his seat, the nervous cough of a man 3 vehicles back, the metallic clink of a canteen being unscrewed. Without the engine noise to drown them out, the distant sounds of the war became starkly clear. The far-off, thudding bass note of heavy artillery, the faint, stitching machine rattle of a machine gun duel miles away. Each sound was a reminder that they were stationary in a place where movement was life. Men began to peer over the sides of their trucks, not with curiosity, but with a hunted look in their eyes. They felt exposed, like cattle in a chute. The sense of shared purpose that had bound them together on the move was fracturing, replaced by an individual, primal need to escape the trap. A new plan was hastily conceived at the head of the column. Seeing the failure of persuasion and physical force, the soldiers attempted bribery. A young private from the lead jeep, his face beaded with sweat, rummaged in his pack and produced a precious, wrinkled apple, saved from his K-ration for a special moment that would now never come. He approached the donkey with the fruit extended in a placating hand, his movements slow and non-threatening. The donkey's nostrils twitched. It lifted its head, its long ears swiveling forward with interest. For a heart-stopping second, it seemed the logjam would be broken. The donkey took a step forward, its lips reaching for the offered treat. The private felt a surge of triumph. But then, with an infuriating capriciousness, the animal stopped, decided the apple was not worth the effort of moving from its chosen spot, and lowered its head back to the grass. The private stood there, apple in hand, a perfect portrait of defeat. The donkey had rejected their tribute. It was a sovereign power, and it demanded nothing less than total submission. The commander, his face a mask of controlled fury, resorted to the chain of command. A runner was dispatched, a lanky, frightened kid who scrambled back down the line of trucks, ducking low as if expecting sniper fire, to find an officer with the authority to make a more drastic decision. Precious minutes bled away with each step he took. The clock was now the enemy, as tangible and threatening as any German soldier. Every tick was a bullet not fired by a frontline rifleman, a mile not advanced by a Sherman tank, a life not saved by a plasma packet sitting uselessly in one of the trucks. What none of the Americans could know, what they could not possibly see, was that they were indeed being watched. A kilometre away, in a second-story bedroom of a shell-blasted farmhouse that lay just beyond a ridge, a man observed the scene through a powerful, tripod-mounted scissor scope. He was not a soldier in the traditional sense. He was Oberleutnant Karl Weber, a former engineering student from Dresden, now a forward observer for a Werfer brigade, a unit equipped with the Nebelwerfer, the terrifying multi-barrel rocket launcher the Allied soldiers called the Screaming Mimi. He had been tracking the convoy's progress for the last hour, listening to the growing roar of its engines, calculating its speed and composition. He had already radioed the coordinates back to his battery, his voice calm and precise. The gunners were ready, the lethal projectiles loaded into their firing racks, waiting only for the final confirmation to unleash a storm of high explosive and white phosphorus. The sudden, unexpected halt of the convoy had been a gift from the gods of war. A moving target was difficult to hit with the area saturation weapons of the Nebelwerfer. A stationary one, especially one confined to such a narrow, linear space, was a perfect target. Weber had watched the initial stop with confusion, then with growing, incredulous glee as he saw the reason for the delay. A donkey. He focused his lenses on the animal, a small, grey speck of profound insignificance that was, at this moment, one of the most effective weapons in the German arsenal. He saw the Americans' futile attempts to move it, the raised rifle that was then lowered, the offered apple that was refused. A grim, humorless smile touched his lips. This was the absurd poetry of war, the entire, meticulous might of the American logistics machine, defeated not by the genius of German strategy, but by the stubbornness of a French farm animal. He checked his watch. The convoy had been stationary for 18 minutes. His finger rested lightly on the transmit button of his field radio. All he had to do was press it, speak a single, coded word, and in less than a minute, the sky over that sunken lane would tear itself apart. The donkey would be vaporized, along with the lead vehicles, and every man in them. The following trucks would be trapped, picked off by the mortar and machine gun teams he knew were moving into position on the flanks. It would be a massacre, a tactical victory of the first order, bought for the price of a single donkey's life. He took a final look through the scope, ensuring the target was still perfectly presented. He saw the American commander pacing, the drivers staring nervously from their cabs. He saw the donkey, a peaceful, dumb center in the storm of human tension. He began to press the button. Back in the lane, the pressure had become unbearable. Sergeant Mack could feel it like a physical pressure in his chest. The air itself seemed to be vibrating with malevolent intent. The birds in the hedgerow had fallen silent. That was the final sign. In his experience, nature always knew first. He made a decision. It was a breach of protocol, an act of insubordination that could see him court-martialed, but his instinct for survival overrode his discipline. He opened his door, the sound of the creaking hinge unnaturally loud in the silence. He jumped down from the cab, his boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He ignored the questioning looks from the soldiers in the truck behind him, and began to walk purposefully toward the head of the column, not running, but moving with a determined stride. He had no plan, no weapon, no authority. All he had was a desperate, gut feeling that they had run out of time. As he walked past the idling trucks, he saw the faces of the drivers, young men, boys really, their eyes wide with a fear they were too proud to voice. They were looking to him, to the older, seasoned sergeant, for a solution he did not have. His presence, however, seemed to have a calming effect. He was doing something. He was movement in a world of stasis. He reached the lead jeep just as the commander was about to give the order to attempt the unthinkable to try and manhandle the donkey off the road using multiple men, a chaotic and likely futile effort that would create even more noise and disruption. Mack didn't look at the commander. He didn't look at the frustrated soldiers. He walked past them all and stopped a few feet from the donkey. He stood there, not moving, not making a sound. He simply looked at the animal. He saw the dust caked in its fur, the gentle weariness in its eyes, the slow, rhythmic pulse of its breathing. He saw not an obstacle but a living thing, a piece of this war-torn land that was simply trying to exist. In that moment, he understood that force, whether a bullet or a shove, was the wrong language. The donkey spoke a different tongue, the language of patience and quiet persistence. Slowly, without any sudden movements, Mack reached into the pocket of his field jacket. He didn't have an apple, but he did have something else. A small, crumpled packet of sugar, pilfered from a K-ration, which he used to sweeten his bitter coffee. He tore the paper top off and, keeping his hand low and open, extended it towards the donkey. He made no sound. He didn't beckon. He just offered. The donkey's ears swiveled. Its nose twitched, sampling the new scent on the air. The scent of pure, simple sweetness. It was a temptation far greater than the apple. The animal took a hesitant step forward, then another. It stretched its neck, its soft, velvety lips, gently nibbling the sugar from Mack's open palm. The tickle of its mouth on his skin was a shock, a connection to a world of simple sensations he had almost forgotten. While the donkey was thus distracted, savouring the unexpected treat, Mack took a slow, deliberate step sideways, off the crown of the road and into the deeper rut. The donkey, focused on the sugar, followed the source of the pleasure, taking 1, 2, 3 steps forward. It was no longer blocking the lane. The path was clear. It was a movement of only a few feet, but in the context of the stalled war machine, it was a continental shift. In the farmhouse, Oberleutnant Weber saw the donkey move. He saw the path clear. He saw the American commander in the jeep frantically wave his arm, signaling the convoy to move forward. The perfect, stationary target was about to become a moving one again. His moment of perfect opportunity was vanishing. He hissed a curse into the static of his radio, his finger pausing on the transmit button. He would have to recalculate. The trap had been sprung, but the prey, thanks to a packet of sugar and a sergeant's intuition, was about to escape its jaws. The first engines coughed back to life. The great iron serpent began to stir, but the delay had done its work. The Germans were now ready, and the convoy was moving straight into the heart of the ambush that had been prepared for it. The sound of the lead jeep's engine roaring back to life was the most beautiful and terrifying sound Sergeant Mack had ever heard. It was the sound of hope, a defiant rasp in the face of the suffocating silence. It was also the sound of exposure, a declaration of movement to whatever unseen eyes were watching. As the jeep began to creep forward, rolling slowly past the now distracted donkey, Mack stood frozen for a moment. The ghost of the animal's soft lips still tingling on his palm. He had performed his small miracle. He had moved the immovable object. But the cold dread in his stomach did not dissipate. It intensified. The lane was clear, but the air was now electric with a predatory anticipation. The birds were still silent. He turned and began to run back towards his truck, his boots pounding on the hard-packed dirt. It was not a sprint of panic, but the determined, heavy-footed run of a man who knows he is racing against an invisible clock. He passed the faces in the other trucks, their expressions shifting from fear to cautious relief as they saw him running and heard the convoy groaning back to life behind him. Drivers were restarting their engines, a wave of mechanical awakening that spread down the column like a chain of firecrackers. But Mack saw the relief on their faces and wanted to scream at them. It's not over. The danger is now. The convoy was no longer a sitting duck. It was a wounded bird taking flight, clumsy and vulnerable. He hauled himself up into the cab of his GMC, slammed the door, and shoved the gear shift into first. The truck lurched forward, its weight immense and reluctant. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the deeper, slower rhythm of the engine. His eyes were no longer on the road directly ahead, but on the hedgerows, scanning for the first sign of the storm he knew was coming. The convoy was accelerating, but it was still trapped in the sunken lane, a linear target gaining speed but no room to maneuver. They were trading one kind of vulnerability for another. In the shell-blasted farmhouse, Oberleutnant Karl Weber watched the convoy begin to move with a cold, professional fury. The perfect, static target was gone. But a moving target in a predictable, constricted path was still a very good one. He had already adjusted his calculations. The lead vehicle was unimportant. The center of the column was the sweet spot. If he could land a salvo there, he would cripple the convoy, trapping the lead elements and destroying the most valuable supplies in the middle. He pressed the transmit button on his radio, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion, uttering the coded phrase that would unleash hell. Falcon strike. Repeat, Falcon strike. Coordinates Delta Niner. Fire for effect. The message was received 2 miles away by the battery of Nebelwerfers. The crews, who had been waiting in a state of tense readiness, sprang into action. The 6-barreled launchers were already aimed and loaded. The command was given. With a series of deafening, sequential roars that shook the very earth, the rockets were unleashed. They left their tubes with a great, fiery breath, arcing high into the grey sky, their trajectories a brutal, primitive arithmetic of death. For a few seconds there was only the sound of their ascent, a tearing, ripping noise that seemed to claw at the fabric of the air. And then came the sound that froze the blood of every Allied soldier who had heard it before, the rising, screaming wail of the incoming rockets, a sound like 1,000 souls being shredded at once. The Germans called them moaning minis. The Americans called them screaming mimes. The name did not matter. Only the consequence did. Sergeant Mack heard the launch. Then he heard the scream. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the spine, triggering a primal fear that no amount of training could ever fully erase. He didn't think. He slammed on the brakes, yanking the massive steering wheel to the right, trying to cram the bulk of his truck as close to the hedgerow as possible. It was a futile gesture, like a child hiding from a tornado under a blanket. All along the column, drivers did the same, the convoy shuddering to a chaotic, jerking halt once again. Men dove from their cabs, scrambling for the dubious cover of the muddy ditches and the thick roots of the hedgerows. They pressed their faces into the earth, their hands clawing at the soil, as if they could burrow their way to safety. The world exploded. The first salvo of rockets landed not at the head of the column, where the donkey had been, nor in the exact centre, but about a third of the way back. The calculation had been off by mere seconds of travel time. The effect was nonetheless catastrophic. A blinding flash of white light was followed by a concussive wave that hit Mac's truck like a physical hammer, rocking it on its axles. The sound was not a single boom, but a rolling, continuous thunderclap of high explosives detonating. Shrapnel, jagged, red-hot pieces of steel casing screamed through the air, shredding canvas, puncturing metal, and tearing through flesh with indiscriminate fury. The air filled with the smell of cordite, burning gasoline, and the coppery scent of blood. A truck 50 yards behind Mac took a direct hit. One moment it was a 10-wheeled behemoth laden with crates of mortar rounds. The next, it was a expanding ball of orange fire and black smoke, its cargo cooking off in a spectacular, terrifying secondary explosion that sent shell fragments whining in every direction. Pieces of the truck, and of the men who had been driving it, rained down on the lane. Another rocket landed just off the road, gouging a fresh crater in the field and sending a geyser of earth and roots skyward. Machine gun fire from the flanks now joined the symphony of destruction, stitching through the smoke, pinning down the soldiers who had sought cover in the ditches. The convoy had been shattered. It was now a segmented, burning snake, trapped and bleeding. The carefully maintained discipline of the supply column disintegrated into a scene of individual survival. But the very event that had made them vulnerable, the donkey-induced delay, had also, paradoxically, saved the majority of them. By holding the convoy up for over 20 minutes, the donkey had disrupted the German observers' original timing. The salvos that were meant to annihilate the entire column from the centre out instead struck a segment of it. The lead segment, including Sergeant Mac's truck and the vital jeep with the commanders, was now cut off from the rear, but it was largely intact and ahead of the main kill zone. Mac raised his head from the steering wheel, his ears ringing, his head swimming. Through the smoke and chaos in his side mirrors, he could see the inferno that had been the middle of his convoy. He saw men running, falling, trying to fight back. But ahead, the lane was clear. The path to the front lines was still open. The supplies in his truck, and in the trucks ahead of him, could still make a difference. The commander in the lead jeep made the only decision he could. He stood up, ignoring the sniper fire now cracking past his head, and waved his arm forward in a sweeping, desperate motion. Go, go, go! It was a brutal calculus of war. To stay was to die and lose everything. To go forward was to save what could be saved, and complete the mission, abandoning the wounded and the trapped to their fate. There was no time for sentiment, for rescue, for grief. The war demanded its tribute, and it had just been paid in blood and steel. Mac shoved his grief and horror into a deep, locked compartment within his soul. He stomped on the accelerator. The GMC's engine roared in protest, then in determination, as the heavy truck lumbered forward, picking up speed. The other drivers in the lead section did the same, a small, battered vanguard breaking away from the carnage. They raced through the sunken lane, the hedgerows now a blur, the sounds of the battle behind them slowly fading, replaced by the pounding of their own hearts and the roar of their engines. They did not look back. To look back was to succumb to a madness from which there was no return. They drove for another 10 minutes, a silent, grim procession of survivors, before the lane finally widened, joining a larger, more secure road where other American units were established. They had made it. The supplies would get through. Later, after the trucks were being unloaded at a forward depot, Sergeant Mac stood alone, leaning against the fender of his vehicle. He was physically exhausted, but his mind was a storm. He replayed the events of the day, the donkey, the stop, the sugar, the rockets, the fireball. He thought of the men he had left behind. He thought of the donkey. An officer walked over, a captain from the logistics corps. Sergeant, hell of a thing back there. We lost good men, but your section got through. Your supplies are already being distributed. You saved a lot of lives up here today. Mac just nodded, unable to speak. The captain shook his head, a look of bewildered anger on his face. Intel says the Germans had that lane zeroed in for an hour. They were just waiting for us to stop. If we hadn't been delayed. His voice trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. Sergeant Mack looked up, his eyes distant. The officer was right. If the convoy had kept its original pace, it would have been in the exact center of that lane when the Nebelwerfer barrage landed. The entire convoy, and everyone in it, would have been annihilated. The donkey, by causing the delay, had saved them. It had been an unwitting angel of mercy, a dumb beast whose stubbornness had, in the chaotic, ironic equation of war, resulted in more lives saved than lost. He never saw the donkey again. He often wondered what became of it, whether it had survived the shelling, if it had simply wandered back to some ruined farm, forever oblivious to the pivotal role it had played in the great, bloody drama of the war. For Sergeant Mack, the war would continue for many more months, but he would never forget the day the advance was halted not by the enemy, but by a creature that simply wanted to eat. He had learned a profound and humbling lesson on that day. In a conflict dominated by the highest technology and the most base human brutality, the outcome could still be swayed by the simplest, most stubborn forms of life. The day a donkey stopped an entire Allied convoy was not just a story of a humorous delay. It was a testament to the chaos of war, where a single braying animal, through sheer indifferent presence, could alter the course of a battle and, in its own strange way, become a forgotten savior.